African culture is the exaltation of speech. For ancient Egyptians, speech was the gift of God to humanity. So, of course, we all know, I don't know who doesn't reference intellectual warfare at ASCAC, but the importance of what we say, what we speak into existence by our language becomes of the utmost importance in this scholastic activity. So, the project, the impetus for my project, I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, if I failed to mention that, is shaping a cooperative vision for boys and men of color in Milwaukee. So what happened is that Milwaukee, and I don't know if you guys are familiar, so Wisconsin has the highest incarcerations of black men in the world, right? So the NPR, BBC has even come to Wisconsin and say, what the hell is happening here that is so bad that y'all are incarcerating somewhere to the rate of around 30%. And when you get into the statistics and how that affects us economically, if you talk about black men ages 18 to 64, you're talking about unemployment due to convictions or having to deal with the criminal justice system being around 60–65%. So we talk about this is actually a problem. It's merited to be a problem. So we can talk about it because I'm dignifying my brothers. It's not their problem, it's a problem with the system. That's how I'm going to phrase it. But this is coinciding with Barack Obama's announcement in 2014 with My Brother's Keeper, the city of Milwaukee, from the nonprofit sector, from the city government sector, from the state, from local business authorities said we want to come together and have a cross-sector approach in how we can support boys and men of color in this area. So they commissioned myself and my dissertation chair from the University of Wisconsin to create this study about shaping cooperative vision. What we were charged to do was interview organizations that serve boys and men of color in the city, and I'll talk about the use of that term in a second, and then to interview them to get additional information so we could talk about how can we create measures or metrics to begin tracking this idea of serving boys and men of color in our area. So just some of the survey data. So far, we've interviewed, had surveys from 51 organizations. 47% of those organizations focus on family, community, or social development. 60% provide direct services to clients. 92% focus on services for black boys and black men. Talking about the demographics of Milwaukee, if you don't know it, Ian, you can correct me if I'm wrong. You talk about the African American population at 44%, the Latino population at like 33, yeah, 33, 35, and then the rest mostly white in some small communities of Asian, mostly on descent. Most organizations identify needs in critical areas of fundraising and leadership. So this survey is still ongoing, so we have people continually contributing. Of course, here we talk about 92% focus on services for black boys and black men. The boys and men of color phrase or discourse or language is because of the Obama My Brother's Keeper. The city of Milwaukee actually was focused on black male achievement. They were one of the cities similar to Detroit and similar to Oakland, who actually started the Office of Black Male Achievement. That's not doing anything, but we'll talk about that another time. But the focus was then changed because of My Brother's Keeper. So after they completed the survey, we did site visits, and the site visits focused on 3 main areas: the scope of the work, the data collection, and how they actually reflected what was going on in their organizations. The intention was to have that quantitative and qualitative data to get a better feel of what these organizations were doing, what their needs were, and what they saw as actual problems facing their communities. So we asked a series of questions, sat down with these organizations for maybe about an hour and a half each. It was usually 2 representatives. We asked it could be anyone from a volunteer, a parent, a person who was receiving services, to the CEO, board president. In these conversations, what we most routinely found is up here, you get like, our mission is to do this, and we are supposed to do this, and blah, 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 blah. The data collection went in 2 areas. Either they spoke directly about what they need to report to their grantors, so they were just telling us whatever the grant requires, this is what we tell them. And 2, they would tell us about like numbers in terms of this many people come through our doors, we serve this many people, blah, 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 blah. But when we got here, everyone had to take a pause for a moment, because most often, they were mentioning things here that were just not done here. Their organizations weren't doing this, nor were they measuring for this, but this is what they actually think should be happening and what they end up to actually do. So you talk about, in particular, with organizations that do mentoring, I think about one after-school program, they say, we're helping literacy, blah, blah, blah. This many kids walk through our doors, blah, blah, blah. However, we know these kids need to make sure they have parent-to-parent one-on-one contact, so what we do is blah, 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 blah. So what they are saying, basically, the things that are actually successful for our organization or success measures are not tracked anywhere, they're not told to anyone, but they're actually the work that we do. And so what we were finding, which was what we thought in the first place, there's excellent work happening in our communities that's not being measured or talked about just because the grantor doesn't know and it's not their mission and vision of the organization. We got to one point and talking about language and our trouble with language, the dissonance that we have in trying to constantly translate all of the emotions and feelings and experiences that we have into this English dialect that we've been forced to speak. One of the CEOs of a small nonprofit organization said, well, to be honest, and I asked her, what does it mean to be successful in your, what does it mean if someone's successful in your program? She said, well, to be honest, I can see it in them. They walk different, they talk different, they carry themselves in a different way. I can see it, I can feel it, but I don't know what to call it. And every time we asked, how do you know we're successful, everybody went, you know. And they just, These are things that people would say, and how do you capture that in the notes? But we were constantly coming up against this, which of course goes to that language thing, it's just not a word for it. So we constantly battle, like, what are they talking about? Is it self-esteem? Is it well-being? Is it love? Is it respect? Is it honor? And we ended up at the word dignity. Dignity. This idea that's a little bit stronger, that I argue, than just respect, than just honor, than just love. Dignity is a network of all those concepts. Dignity is argued in the concept of ma'at, is that it's something that's inherent, that's within us. I am a human being, I am divine, therefore I'm dignified. So there's that, but there's also the attributed dignity that we have because we recognize one another. Because we're in a society, or because we're in communication, I can dignify you by saying, you know, whatever. You see me with my name badge on that says that ASCAC, there's a sort of attributed dignity that's there. There's attributed dignity that comes with somebody saying I have a PhD, whatever that could mean or not mean. There's attributed dignity saying I'm from a particular family, particular area. There's all types of ways that we also give dignity. So we talk about dignity having those dual concepts. So this is a kind of a map. This is a kind of map of human dignity that we are talking about, or still in development of. So at the top, you have full inherent human dignity, which will be the guiding principles of work. Like, this is the way that we should be doing this work. In particular, if we're talking about boys and men of color, because this resonates with them in ways that most of our organizations don't. The guiding principles mean dignity as autonomy, which is that's a whole other paper in and of itself. Dignity as humanity, I'm a human being. Dignity as rank being like I'm the elder, I'm a child. There's a dignity that's associated with that. At the bottom is non-inherent human dignity, the dignity that we kind of earn or acquire through our lives. You can't really see, but there's relational, substantive, identity and recognition, attributed, and inflorescent. So we talk about the conversation of those two types of dignity within these organizations. One, the guiding principle needs to be, you know, we need to treat everybody as human beings. We need to be rooted in that whole concept. But the indicators means, well, do we actually mean that stuff? And the type of questions that were in our survey that validated it, say if you serve, which 92% of our organizations did, said that their primary service area was boys and men of color, but then 13%, only 13% of them had boys or men of color in leadership at their organizations. Therefore, translating that there's no dignity in rank or merit at your organization. So, what we're saying is that to your grant funder, because 132 people walked in the door, it looks like you did a great job, right? But to you, you might say, well, people might be reading higher than they were when they first came in here. Great. However, at the end of the day, there is a measure of dignity that's not being fulfilled there. So when we talk about dignity actually driving your organization, having an organization switch and say, okay, we need to make sure we have more boys and men of color in leadership roles, how does that then change everything else that's happening in this organization? So it's really shifting of what success measures and achievement should look like in these organizations, or attempting to. This is just a brief idea, because I get into this whole, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights puts dignity in there. It's an interesting story of how dignity was actually tied to that concept. It was one of the few concepts that went cross-culture and cross-language barriers that everyone said is something important enough that we need to include it. However, we look at the American concept of dignity. Dignity has been wrapped up in whiteness, so tightly woven that we don't even think about the word dignity meaning that when we have it here. From 1641, when the Massachusetts Body of Liberty was written, which legalized slavery and defined civil liberties in the same sentence, therefore meaning that dignity is being able to be white and have these liberties, and the undignified life is black. So that was the, it's very simple. Dignity is like so simple that you're like, damn, why didn't I think about this before? That's what I was like. And black codes, voting tests, Jack Johnson being the impetus of the 1913 anti-miscegenation laws was totally about dignity, because Jack Johnson was the most dignified person in the world if you ask him, right? Because he decided to start marrying these white women. Of course, they had to make a law to say, sir, you need to stop acting like you got all the dignity in the world. The presumption of having dignity is the basis on which citizenship is conferred and confirmed, while dignity's denial or claimed absence is the justification of which citizenship is withheld. And this is from Nick Bromwell, who's at the University of UMass. He's at UMass, and he wrote this very, very interesting article about black political indignation, calling out the fact that resistance, like we have talked to throughout this whole conference, resistance is really the expression of one's dignity. and saying that the moment I feel indignant about something, that means you can't do that to me, is me recognizing my own human dignity in ways that you are not.
What's his name again?
Bromwell, B-R-O-M-W-E-L-L. I can give you the full citation too. So, conceptualizing dignity for black male achievement work, just so we go through this really quickly. Dignity is the restoration of ma'at. Karenga argues in ma'at, the moral imperative, about human divinity and human agency being the expression of human dignity, which is the root of Mahat ethic. Intellectual warfare, talking about language as not a knowledge production, therefore the scholars have a responsibility to engage in language in discourse, therefore we have to also make sure that we enter in using terms that measure accurately what we're trying to measure. Bellum, in 2010, talked about, well, dignity is great. South Africa actually has dignity written in their constitution post-apartheid, but he said that's all well and great, but does that actually translate into an African concept of dignity? And so he brings out the concepts, I don't know if I'm pronouncing them right, Sarithi and Isidima, as saying they're more accurate and more applicable to an African sense of human dignity. So bringing measures towards what does it mean to be culturally rooted in your own dignified self. Frederick Douglass talks a lot about dignity. He says, in My Bondage, My Freedom, when he was fighting with Mr. Covey, that the expression of force is essential to one's human dignity. If you're unable to do that, then you're unable to express yourself in your true humanity. So his recognition was in that fight with Mr. Covey of saying, like, oh, I'm a human because I was able to exert myself, and being indignant causes resistance, which means I'm asserting my dignity. Malcolm X, in the founding the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he talks about the importance of dignity in the founding statements of the organization. Of course, Kwame Ture, when he talks about Black Power, the story that I allude to here is when he was talking about the need for a civil rights bill had everything to do with white people not recognizing my dignity, and I've always known that I had it. Martin Luther King, he uses the concept but talks about somebodiness. Develop ourselves within ourselves a deep sense of somebodyness, which is again a human dignity concept. And of course, Adam Clayton Powell, Black Power means black dignity, and it's beautiful, right? And of course, Dr. Ben, the Africa I've spoken of, you need to know, and no one can keep you a slave after you know it, which again is another sense of African dignity or black dignity being affirmed. So we're talking about concepts of black dignity. The four things that I pulled out is that black dignity should be the catalyst of black male achievement work. So we talk about, in 2013, one of the vice, I don't know what they're called, of the UN, made a speech about the importance of looking at the development projects of the UN. And he says, what gets measured matters, and what matters is measured. So at the end of the day, if we're not putting dignity in here as the actual success indicator, we're not actually doing the work that we're set out to do. So achievement is not the number of people coming through the door. It needs to be surrounding this concept of dignity, not just human, but black dignity. The basis of black dignity must follow Ma'at ethics. Language construct should be the impetus for this change. And Black dignity, of course, if we then get to affirming and measuring it, then we're actually talking about Black power and how it manifests itself in these communities. So, of course, this wraps up all into MBK and how MBK has a community challenge. And Milwaukee and all these cities, I believe, Seattle actually has some projects surrounding this too, about how we then interpret those for our own communities. So yeah, we can do what we need to do to be a part of the initiative to connect to the larger national conversation. But if we put dignity in as our measurement of saying this is how we're going to say whether or not we've been successful for boys and men of color, particularly Black males, then we can begin to change the dialogue, and the other cities would soon end up following. So that's kind of the root of where we're going in Milwaukee. What comes from this is the creation of the dignity scale. And the only sector right now that has an actual dignity measurement is in nursing, and it's about palliative end-of-life care. And of course, we know that's focused on white males, and so we need to make sure that we culturally apply it so that we can create measures that actually have meaning and work for our existence. China, their school system actually has a dignity scale that's implemented for middle and high school students. But it's not found as much in education as it is into that healthcare, nursing home, end-of-life care. So we're in the process of actually taking the measures and the scope of those tests and applying them into BMA work, and make it, the challenge for us is to say, how can we make it cross-sector? Meaning that if we're doing workforce development, how do we put a dignity measure there that can also be used in the preschool? So that's kind of where we are in the next phases of this development. Thank you.
Have questions